some reason, and I think this is probably as much true in the US as it is here in Asia, these proper data warehouses either never happened or they're always half baked, and then data lakes to a certain extent were a bit more feasible because there's less integration work needed up front. But still, the promise of having these repositories providing insight and these companies start acting like Google, I don't think it ever happened. And then that's what makes the Gen AI trend interesting in the sense because you can have very messy information and somehow that thing will process it. Now, whether it gives you a proper opinion or not, I think that's another perspective altogether. But it seems like it's a way of surmounting a little bit of this mess. I don't know if that's how people are thinking about it, but I see that's one direction it could go, assuming that core technology doesn't mutate again into something else. um but ultimately it's still the same need. Companies still need data driven insight. Companies still need a way of optimizing costs or growing revenue. It still boils down to that. The problem with the kind of the old ways we were doing before is the only thing these data warehouses guaranteed was additional cost, right? The cost line
Yeah.
jacks up. You have licenses, you have staff. These data scientists don't come cheap, and the returns are always a promise. I speaking from experience. We used to sell that a lot in Teradata. Oh, you have the promise of greater revenue. The only thing it really ended up doing was bloating the cost line. And assuming you have a good sponsor for the project, who's not just an IT guy, then you sort of have a kind of a yeah, maybe there was one exception that I found viable, which is in banking. Regulatory reports.
Yeah, sure.
You didn't need to
Right.
earn money from
And
that. You just needed
everything
to produce it, right? So I think that's a
everything
good.
you need for financial accounting is very well organized.
Yeah.
The people are on top of that because they go to jail if that stuff isn't right, right?
Yeah.
Anything outside of that is all over the place. Um, Again, we're in data warehouses. We're generally talking about tabular data that's
Hmm.
been structured into a schema, pre-structured, and I mean, I think the reason that broke down, a perfect example, another bank. I worked with a lot of banks.
Yeah.
Another bank that had won an award for data warehousing excellence. They had a very large Teradata warehouse. And, I worked for SAS at the time. I and my team had to go in there into this bank and they had a marketing program. They were trying to build some campaigns. So we looked at their schema. Well, it turns out that this bank had a great schema at one time, very, very consistent, very well organized. But then they
Hmm.
acquired a bank, right? And since
Acquisition. Okay.
they couldn't really afford, they didn't want to spend the money that it would take to actually merge the two schemas into a common schema. They just dumped the other bank into a separate schema. I'm not
Hmm.
even sure there was a single key that joined. So
Just getting
the
in there. Yeah.
developing campaigns where they wanted to cross sell or where they wanted to do a bank, a bank wide analysis across both original banks required running a query against one schema, running a query against another schema,
Double
extracting
the effort. Yeah.
out of the warehouse, putting it into SAS, joining it in SAS, building tables and doing the analysis there. By the way, that's why SAS is still in business because the data is still garbage, right? And people that actually have to work with it, need fairly sophisticated tools that they can use to do what hasn't been done in the back end. Because it will never be done, right? It's always going to be cheaper to hire a bunch of expert analysts, to munge the data on request than it will be to make everything perfect in the data platform.
Hmm.
So
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we got a little bit of history, and then maybe let's look at it from another dimension. I mean, we had data mining, which became, I don't know, there was a term called decision science for a while, and then predictive analytics and data science.
Yeah.
and then now AI, which seems like a weird deviation because as far as Gen AI is concerned, it's not your usual predictive stuff. It's generative. It's a very different approach.
It is.
It seems to work better for, ironically, for non-quantitative use cases like content, text.
Yeah.
So, any thoughts on that? So, is that going to change the engagement model, quote unquote, consultant speak? I mean, how people actually use this stuff? And you said it was disrupted to the vendors. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, the biggest disruption in the past 20 years was Tableau, right? Tableau came into the market and displaced a lot of business intelligence and Cognos users, for example. In other words, the introduction of Click and Tableau came in and brought visualization tools that were simple to use. And that displaced a lot of the traditional BI tools that were getting increasingly complex. And it's perfect example of Christensen disruption, right?
Yeah.
In other words, you have an industry where the leaders get increasingly feature rich and expensive because they're competing with one another. And then, competitors enter and disrupt it because they're simpler and cheaper.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
lot, I mean, there's nothing that you can do in Tableau that you can't do in, let's say, Cognos, right?
Yeah,
It's just,
exactly. Pretty much.
and there's a lot of things in that you can't do in Tableau. But simplicity is a good thing because when you have just enough capability to satisfy a large group of users, you now have a product that has, potential widespread adoption, as was the case with Tableau. But let's backtrack and let's focus more on the advanced analytics side. In 1992, I was working in a bank that's now part of Citibank, in the credit card business. And how did we do analysis? How did we build models? We built logistic regression models with SAS on a mainframe, right?
That's a very
And
classic one. Yeah.
oh, I mean, that's what we used.
Yeah.
And you know, I attended workshops on neural networking. I actually tried to use neural nets, but in that day, I didn't have enough computing power to train a neural net well enough to outperform a logistic regression
They were
model.
pretty much useless, weren't they? I remember that as well. The neural networks were a joke back in the day.
We didn't have
Yeah.
enough computing power. I mean, so you couldn't add a million hidden layers, and yeah. So, yeah. The other thing is on tabular data, I doubt very seriously that neural networks would ever outperform, something like XGBoost, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
neural networks are great for applications where you really can't use tools that are ideal for tabular data.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
text analytics, computer vision, all that good stuff. And that's where most of the artificial neural networks started really making headway. But this is in 1992. We thought we were cool because our data sets had 10 million records.
Yeah.
And the
Big
10
data.
10 million record SAS files were spread over 15 cartridges in IBM tape storage, right? And there were kids, literally kids, on roller skates in this enormous library.
Yeah.
That your job, you'd run it, and your job with a message would appear on the console. Go load tape number such and such and such. Kids would go roller skating off. They would come back with the tape. The operator loads it. Your job continues, right? And so your typical one logistic run runs overnight, if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, the kid can't find that particular tape reel, right? And you get a message back you come in the next morning and you get a message that your job failed, right?
Data
And then
not
you
found. Job
yeah,
failed.
exactly right. Right. Well, that's how things were. I mean, logistic regression was the best thing available. And you know what? I built a model there that they used for 15 years, right? In other words, logistic regression isn't a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, the group of people that I work with were mostly master degreed people with stats backgrounds
Statistics. Yeah.
primarily. Yeah.
Mm.
And our team was connected to the marketing department. There was a separate team connected with the credit risk group, and there wasn't a whole lot of conversation between the credit risk analysts and the marketing analysts because they speak different languages. But all that said, the marketing analytics team did a lot more than logistic regression. I mean, our analytics team would run all the numbers for the marketing folks. And, the biggest complaint is we had people who were advanced degrees in statistics. They wanted to build more models. And, what the marketing people wanted was, how many, sales did we make in our last campaign? A fairly simple table. But I think the lesson there is that analysts really do need to be embedded in the business, because we were embedded in the business, we could go to marketing and say, you know what, we could build a model for you that would help you do this. Back then, I mean, this is 1992. You really had to sell people on the idea that an analytical model might actually improve the results of their campaign.